I miss him and I keep looking for that chemistry. How do I end this loop when he's the one who left me? So this is a question that I often hear in my practice, and I think it really reflects a common struggle that I see, which is this pursuit of connection that can sometimes elude us, especially when we may have been in a relationship with someone that was more unavailable. This is a pattern which often evolves in what I call the anxious avoidant trap. So that is a dynamic where the one person is really craving a lot of closeness. In the attachment lingo, we might call that person more anxiously attached, while the other person seeks some emotional distance when things start to become more committed or more intimate. And that person, we might say, has more of an avoidant attachment style. And so these relationships can feel very intoxicating because they tend to mimic early push-pull dynamics from our attachment relationships when we were younger. And so they can create a sense of instant familiarity mixed with a sense of uncertainty, and that can be very arousing. Okay. It can be very alluring because it can trigger intense emotional highs and lows that mimic the feeling of being in love. Moving on from this circumstance usually requires a deeply compassionate form of self-inquiry. And so there's 3 steps along this journey. The first is redefining chemistry as an arousal state that is often fueled by adrenaline and dopamine highs mixed with projections of our desires and fears. Secondly, examining the narratives that we start telling ourselves about our lovability, our worth, and our desirability when we're confronted with these difficult relationships. Thirdly, reflecting on our beliefs about reality in general and how might clinging to our grief or our attachment to that other person be rewarding for us in some way. How is that actually a form of self-protection? I'd like to explore these a little bit in greater detail. And by exploring these areas, we're really addressing not just the immediate pain, but also starting to engage with what I'm going to refer to as the deeper spiritual lessons that are inherent in these types of relationships. And so this is a process that I believe gradually creates space for a love that is actually more aligned with your true self, your higher self, the essence of your being. Okay. So ideally, the goal is to develop the skill to differentiate between healthy and unhealthy emotional dynamics, to help you feel less trapped by past patterns and more empowered to create fulfilling relationships, secure relationships, to save yourself from repeated heartbreaks and invest in nurturing connections that really uplift you, and also to achieve what I call soul-centered security, which means that you're going to approach your relationships with a sense of resilience and discernment. You are setting the tone of the relationship that you want, not just responding to what's going on in your environment. Let's dive into this. The first thing I want to talk about is looking at the chemistry of anxious avoidant dynamics. What do we mean when we say chemistry? So let's redefine chemistry biologically speaking on 2 different levels. So first, we have the attachment system. On the level of the body, attachment styles really express a habit of nervous system response that taught us we either needed to fight for a relationship. So this is more of that sort of anxious reaching for or clinging for someone. We needed to fly away until it was safe to come back. And this is where we see the more avoidant withdrawal and pulling back and need for space. Or when fighting for or pulling or pushing away didn't work, we froze. And so we sort of became stuck in this unpredictable pattern of maybe it'll work this time, maybe flying away works the other time. There's nothing I can do to find safety. And this is more of the fearful, avoidant, or disorganized attachment pattern. When we have learned those habitual patterns of response to threats to our safety, in other words, when we felt as if the person that we were with was either moving too close for safety or moving too far away for safety, then these are the patterns of response that we learned to maintain a certain proximity, right? So a lot of times we get confused. Well, I feel like I'm anxious with this person and I feel like I'm avoidant with that person. It's not that you're flip-flopping. It's the proximity that you require to feel safe. If you're with someone who pulls away more than you do, you're going to start to move towards them. And if you're with someone who wants to be closer than you do, you're going to start to pull away from them. But it's the degree of proximity that makes you feel safe, that is consistent, regardless of if you start moving forward, back, or forward. You're still maintaining a certain distance. Okay. So that's the attachment piece. Then we take a look at the second part of the biological influence on attachment, and that is frustration, attraction, and neurochemical stimulation. So on the level of the body, this is when we feel an intense attraction, because when we have this push-pull dynamic going on, it creates an intermittent pattern of reinforcement. This is when your rewards are big, but unpredictable. For example, in Ellen Fisher's research, she has found frustration attraction to be the result of these push-pull dynamics and intermittent patterns of reinforcement, and it acts on the same parts of the brain as gambling and drug addiction. Okay, so that's why I say sometimes we experience attraction as adrenaline and dopamine highs. The dopamine is that hit you get when you have that intense feeling of closeness. But then the adrenaline kicks in with the stress around not knowing when you're going to get it. So now your adrenaline and your stress hormones make you hyper focused on that partner, but you also never know when they're actually going to show up and give you all that love and attention and all that desirability that you want to experience in relationship. So this is where it creates the sort of love addicted patterns. And that's why we see these push-pull things in relationships, and oftentimes people call it chemistry. And this is particularly true if there have been instances of abuse or trauma in your past, that it can create that kind of conflation of love and bonding with a degree of trauma response. So this is sometimes called trauma bonding or codependency. I think codependency is a flavor of trauma bonding. What does that look like in real time? Well, this is when partners respond to our fearfulness with their own triggered behavior. And their behavior then validates what we are afraid of, and it creates increasing feelings of threat and unsafety in the relationship, which then we respond in a defensive way, and now it triggers them, and they feel increasingly unsafe, and it's kind of a downward spiral. So here's an example of this. I have aspects of avoidant or dismissive avoidant attachment. My problem is that my girlfriend is more anxious, leaning towards disorganized or fearful avoidant, and when I need to pull back, her abandonment fears are triggered. So her emotional swings are really flooding for me, and they just completely derail me. She can escalate so quickly that I cannot gather my thoughts well enough to respond in the moment. And I find that I fumble with my words, and then it only tends to make things worse. I have to step away and decompress so I don't worsen the situation, but then that only makes her more upset and chases me down. I'm trying to be present and supportive, but then she tells me that I am not being that way because I don't agree with why she's upset, or I'm not soothing her to the extent that she desires. So she thinks I'm the villain, or that I do not have her back, when truly I'm just in self-protection mode. I want to help her, but I also feel emotionally unsafe with her, and I don't want to wind up being her pincushion. So in this case, you see how neither one really feels emotionally safe because they are relying on the other person to create that safety first. This is what happens in these anxious avoidant trap scenarios, but it's also something that we experience as a high level of chemistry. If you want to learn more about the deconstruction of that example, I'll leave a link in the caption of this video to check out that other video I released where I go into that example in depth. For our purposes here today, we want to look at how are we going to move on from this. In my opinion, it brings us to the more psycho-spiritual aspects of these relationships. Emotions are just big energy moving through our body. And so when we have powerful energy, big energy moving through our bodies, the mind needs to make sense of it in some way. And so there's a couple of things that happen. First, we tend to project anticipated outcomes onto the other person or into the relationship because we're trying to mitigate any fears or feelings of unsafety by imagining that we can predict and control the outcome. But then when we do that, we wind up creating the outcomes that we're afraid of. So for example, let's say in an anxious state, a jealous partner demands the password to their partner's devices. And so that distrust projects a negative assumption into the other partner. You're a cheater and you're untrustworthy. And so that partner starts to feel falsely accused. And now they feel unsafe in the relationship, as if their affections are not being acknowledged and as if they can't do anything right. And so the accused partner becomes angry. Maybe they start to feel defensive against fears of failure, rejection, or being helpless to build trust in the relationship. And so then they decide, you know what? I might as well do what they're accusing me of doing since they've already punished me for it anyway. And so now this is what we call an introject. The identity of the cheater has become introjected into the partner and they've taken it in, right? They're assuming that identity now. Similarly, let's say the more avoidant partner is going to anticipate that their lover will become anxiously demanding, needy, and invasive over time. And so to head off that possibility, they're going to prematurely withdraw from the relationship without warning or any kind of clear explanation as to why. And that becomes really confusing, and it makes their partner increasingly anxious because there doesn't seem to be any real clear reason for it. And so now they become increasingly demanding of answers. And so now the avoidant partner looks at that and says, see, I knew that would happen. I was right all along. But you see how these became self-fulfilling prophecies, right? So projections into the relationship. Now, the second thing that happens is we tend to split off into different parts. We split ourselves off into different parts. And those parts over time start to organize the difficult emotions for us, which becomes maladaptive in new and future contexts. So inner child healing and parts work has a really wonderful way of conceptualizing those patterns. So inside of us, there's a younger part of us that wants to relive in order to revise these patterns for the sake of a sense of wholeness and ultimately expanding consciousness and feeling a sense of spiritual expansion. But there are other protective parts inside of us, which in internal family systems theory, they call this managers or firefighters, who are kind of stuck in repeating old patterns of self-protection or defensive response, which prevent us from really learning new ways of loving. And that might allow us to feel more confident, safe, or trusting first in our own resilience in love, and then of the possibility of love with other people. When that happens, we are repressing parts of ourselves. And then we meet someone who maybe expresses some aspect of ourselves that we are repressing, we feel more whole in their presence. And that's that love feeling. There's a big energy in us that rises up to meet its counterpart. That's sort of the shadow aspect of attraction, that the things in our shadow are responding to the things in their shadow. And when you come together, that polarity finds its other half. I often have clients saying, oh, they're my twin flame, or they're my other half, right? And we might argue maybe there is a spiritual element to that. There is some element of a soulmate relationship within that, because what's happening in that moment? Well, you're becoming increasingly aware of what aspects of yourself have you repressed or denied. And so as you start to look at and embrace those parts, now you become more fully integrated. But the misconception is that it's the other person who provided it for you. On the contrary, the other person provided a mirror, a container, or a focal point for you to see and understand how to call that feeling up within yourself. And now your job is to inhabit that feeling and to create more opportunities for that to be stimulated within you so that you step more fully into yourself with or without the partner. That would be more of the soul lesson here. And that would be the message of a soul mate, is to help you connect more fully to your soul. This is where and how I think that we start to heal these things, meaning we start to shift our attraction patterns and move away from being adrenaline and dopamine high seeking and defining chemistry as needing to work hard for love, because we've conflated working hard with some level of suffering for love. And if we're not suffering with love, then it's not true love. Right? How do we heal that concept and how do we shift those beliefs? Well, I think that means we have to make whatever the once adaptive but now maladaptive beliefs and cognitive patterns, we need to make them known. We need to become aware of those patterns so that we can work with them and heal them on the level of the mind, body, and spirit. It is embodied, it is psychological, and it is emotional and spiritual. So that really brings us back to the whole first part of this segment, right? So first, we are redefining chemistry as an arousal state driven by adrenaline and dopamine highs, along with self-projections. And so how do we sift and sort through that? Well, we might ask ourselves the question, what did this relationship show me about myself and the way that I love? Number two, we want to notice what stories are coming up in our minds, and what are the narratives going through your head about your lovability, your self-worth, and your desirability in the absence of that person and or in their rejection. So where can I learn to love myself more? Or in other words, where and how was I sacrificing parts of myself in this relationship? And number 3, you want to notice your beliefs about reality in general and how staying in, let's say, a grief state, mourning the loss, perseverating on a specific person could actually be rewarding or protecting you. How am I continuing to reject love by rejecting myself through clinging to this person who rejected me? So how is that protecting you? How is that rewarding you? Usually the reward is that something in there is keeping you safe. And yet there's also another part, a deeper, I might argue, more secure and spiritual part that may have attracted this relationship so that you can start to attend to and answer these questions for yourself. And once you do, all that grief is going to make space for a more fulfilling love to come in. So I think that's probably where I'm going to end for this segment. But if you want to learn more about these topics in depth, I do have a playlist on my YouTube channel. Specifically, it's looking at healing the inner child with parts work. And there will be some somatic exercises in there as well. So I'll leave a link to that in the caption of this video on the replay. And with that, I'd love to know if any of this is resonating with you, if any of these themes, topics, questions have come up for you. I would love to know how that has manifested in your experience in the comments or in the chat. Also, remember to subscribe and ring the bell for notifications. I put out videos once a week and I wouldn't want you to miss out.